Welcome to Fjook Enterprises YouTube channel. As always, this voice is your host Fjook, and joining me today is
Anthony.
Today, once again, we are continuing Drunkards, Senators, and More, past Canadian Prime Ministers. In case you skipped the other episodes, as I said, Fjook, I am someone who is very interested in learning about the history of my country, Canada. But that is why I have Anthony here. Anthony, why don't you go over your credentials once again?
So I have a bachelor's in political science with a concentration in Canadian political science from Carleton University. And I've just had a lifelong interest and love of the Canadian government, our institutions, and our prime ministers.
This first question really should have been on the last video, but I forgot about it till we were talking about this video. You once told me that John A. Macdonald regretted having to hang Riel for high treason. Is that true?
Regretting may have been a nice term. Sir John A. Macdonald at that time could have been more lenient to Luis Riel, but he believed that Riel, had he been left to live, could have started other revolts. The Red River Rebellion was not Riel's first case of rebellion. So he had critics on so Macdonald had critics on both sides. Had he gone too harsh, or had he not gone harsh enough? Macdonald did take the calculated risk that he knew that Quebec would revolt if they did hang Riel, and Quebec did Riel, and they burned effigies of him in the streets. And then on the other side, he had people, English supporters, like the Bishop of St. Albert, that had sent Sir John A. Macdonald the following note. These poor half-breeds would never have taken up arms against the government had not a miscreant of their own nation, Riel, profiting by their discontent, excited them thereto. He gained their confidence by a false and hypocritical piety, and having drawn them from their benefit influence of their clergy, he brought them to look upon himself as a prophet, a man inspired by God, and specially charged with a mission in their favor, and forced them to take up arms. So you can see he was definitely in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation.
Now, one of the things that Sir John A. Macdonald did was build a railway. Who did he have building the first railway that connected British Columbia to Nova Scotia?
So I'm glad there that you specified British Columbia. So the rail between Ontario through most of Western Canada was built by either locals or imported immigrants. But it was the railway had difficulty in obtaining an adequate workforce in British Columbia. And this is what led to the controversial importation of thousands of Chinese workers. Around 15,000 Chinese laborers helped build the Canadian Pacific Railway. They worked in harsh conditions for little pay, and there are historians that have estimated that at least 600 of them have died.
So, why is there not as many Chinese people in Canada if so many of them built the railway?
Between 1885 and 1923, Chinese immigrants had to pay a head tax to enter Canada. The tax was levied under the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885. It was the first legislation in Canadian history to exclude immigration on the basis of ethnic background. With a few exceptions, Chinese people had to pay at least $50 to come to Canada. The tax was raised to $100 and then to $500. During the 38 years that the tax was in effect, around 82,000 Chinese immigrants paid nearly $23 million in tax. The head tax was removed with the passing of the Chinese Immigration Act in 1923.
So just to be clear, it was Sir John A. Macdonald who introduced the head tax originally.
His government did.
Okay, so with the head tax and the residential schools, was Sir John A. Macdonald ahead of his time in any aspect then?
So a lot of scholars will point out to the fact that Sir John A. Macdonald was ahead of his time in believing that women should have the right to vote. He believed that women were equal to men and that they should have the right to vote.
I realize this next question really jumps topics, but this is a grab bag episode, so that's to be expected. But anyways, why did McDonald feel that the West needed its own police force?
So the Northwest Mounted Police, so again, this is not the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, this is its forefather, the Northwest Mounted Police, was born out of a need for a national police force to implement the law in Canada's newly acquired Western Territories, which would have been sparsely populated, with the exception of First Nations, and they were definitely used as a tool to confine the First Nations and limit their growth.
That doesn't sound nice.
Well, it's not necessarily that it is or isn't nice. It is what it is. The police definitely, like most police, even nowadays, a lot of them come in with good intentions, and the policy may have had some good intentions, but left unregulated or with a strong arm of a leader, it can be a tool to limit and curtail freedoms of certain populations.
This question wasn't on the list of questions, but with what you said about how this was the forefather and what this police force was, one of the reasons this police force was made, could one make the argument that the RCMP has systemic racism in it due to this fact?
So, of course, all organizations need to reflect on what they've done in the past. The RCMP, over the course of many years, was responsible for bringing Aboriginals to residential schools. So they definitely have, the RCMP and its forefather have definitely played a role in not only building Canada the way it is, but also building some of these institutions, both good and bad. And I think we have to take the time as Canadians to review our history, and we have to make sure that if there is any injustice, that we can't bury it, that we have to reflect on it and make sure that we improve for the future. As for systemic racism, I know this is where the current chief of the RCMP got in a lot of trouble, because she almost refused to answer this question when she was originally asked this by the CBC. And I think that there are many definitions for this word, or for this term. And yes, at some level, so the RCMP has practiced systemic racism.
So, I believe in previous private conversations you mentioned that there were other federal police forces, not just the Northwest Mounted Police. Who were they and what were their names?
So in 1868, there was another police force, a federal police force created called the Dominion Police, and they were literally the protectors for the Parliament buildings, and they enforced federal laws across all of Canada.
There's a lot of political issues we could discuss of Canada during Sir John A. Macdonald's time, specifically considering the early prime ministers were literally nation builders. But let's switch gears slightly. Did he have a good and large family?
So this is one aspect where Sir John A. was never really lucky in life. He was married twice, and he fathered many children. His first wife grew deeply ill very quickly. His daughters all passed away. His children, all except for one, passed away, all at relatively young ages. And I'm not sure if I had mentioned this in a previous podcast, but his brother, he saw brutally killed by a housekeeper who was watching over them when he was at a very young age.
You mentioned that a lot of his kids died young, and his wife died, and his first wife died. With that type of luck, did any of his kids survive to do anything of note?
So yes, so he had one surviving adult son, and his name was Sir Hugh John Macdonald, and he was not only the only surviving son of Sir John A. Macdonald, but he was also himself a politician. He served as a member in the House of Commons, and he was a federal cabinet minister, and he also served, funny enough, he served briefly as the 8th Premier of Manitoba, the province his father created.
One of the provinces his father created.
Well, the first.
Next time, we're going to be talking about the second Prime Minister of Canada, who, unlike the other Prime Ministers, had only one term of office, and also it was in the middle of Sir John A. Macdonald's time as Prime Minister. I am referring to Alexander Mackenzie, I believe his name is, right?
Yes.
And that episode is probably going to be a bit slightly different than this one. I need to discuss that a bit more with Anthony. But as always, comment, like, and subscribe.
Yes. Have a good evening.